The stars had never looked so menacing to Dr. Anne Reed as they did through the reinforced viewing window of Luna Station. She pressed her palm against the cold metal frame and watched the distant lights twinkle in the void. Somewhere out there, beyond human sight, massive ships were moving through space with deadly purpose. Reed turned back to her workstation, where dozens of screens displayed cascading data streams. As the station's lead communications specialist, she had been tracking unusual energy patterns for 3 weeks. The readings made no sense according to human understanding of physics. Objects the size of small moons were somehow moving faster than anything should be able to move, leaving ripples in space-time that their instruments could barely detect. The other scientists at Luna Station had dismissed her findings as equipment malfunctions. Dr. Williams, the station commander, had even suggested she take some time off, but Reed knew what she was seeing. These weren't natural phenomena or broken sensors. Something was coming, and it was bigger than anything humanity had ever encountered. 3 light-years away, Commander Thax of the crystalline Viridian race stood in the central command chamber of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion. His body was a living sculpture of blue-green crystal that caught and reflected the soft bioluminescent lights of the ship's walls. Around him, holographic displays showed the positions of 50,000 vessels spread across several star systems, all moving in perfect coordination toward the same destination. The neural web hummed through Thax's consciousness like a gentle river of shared thought. Every commander, every navigator, every tactical officer in the fleet was connected through this quantum network. Their minds worked as one, their decisions flowing seamlessly from ship to ship. It was the greatest achievement of the galactic hegemony, the tool that had allowed 12 different species to conquer and control 3/4 of the known galaxy. Through the web, Thax felt the presence of Admiral Corvin, a being of pure energy from the luminous collective. The Admiral's thoughts touched his mind with the warmth of shared purpose. The target system contained a Class M planet with a primitive species that had somehow developed faster than light travel without joining the hegemony. Such independence could not be tolerated. The intelligence reports were clear. The inhabitants of the third planet called themselves humans and had achieved basic space travel only centuries ago. They had no energy shields, no quantum weapons, no neural networks. Their largest vessels were tiny metal constructs that moved through space using chemical propulsion. They would surrender within hours of the fleet's arrival, as countless species had done before. Back on Luna Station, Reed's instrument suddenly exploded with activity. Energy signatures that had been barely detectable were now blazing across her screens like miniature suns. She called out to her assistant, Tom Bradley, who was working at a station across the room. "Tom, look at this. Something's happening near Jupiter." Bradley hurried over, his coffee mug still in hand. He was young, fresh out of the academy, and still believed that human technology could explain anything. When he saw Reed's displays, his face went pale. "That's impossible. Nothing that big can just appear out of nowhere." But Reed was already switching to the visual sensors, her fingers dancing across the control interface. The screens flickered, showing the familiar orange and tan swirls of Jupiter's atmosphere. Then, like ghosts materializing in daylight, shapes began to appear. First one, then dozens, then hundreds of massive structures emerged from some kind of advanced cloaking technology. The ships were beautiful and terrifying. Some looked like living organisms, with smooth organic curves and bioluminescent markings that pulsed with life. Others were geometric marvels of crystal and metal that seemed to bend light around them. The largest vessels stretched for kilometers, dwarfing anything in Earth's space fleet. Reed's hands shook as she activated the station's emergency protocols. Red lights began flashing throughout Luna Station, and automated systems started broadcasting warnings to Earth and all human colonies. But she knew it was probably too late. Whatever these beings wanted, humanity was not prepared to resist them. Commander Thax felt satisfaction flow through the neural web as his fleet dropped their stealth fields. The primitive detection equipment on the small moon orbiting the target planet had finally noticed their presence. Soon, the humans would receive the standard surrender broadcast, translated into their simple languages and transmitted on frequencies their crude radio systems could understand. The message was always the same, refined over thousands of successful conquests. Surrender peacefully and become part of the hegemony's great civilization. Resist and face complete annihilation. Most species chose survival over pride. The few that chose to fight usually lasted less than a day against the combined might of the hegemony fleet. But as Thax prepared to give the order to broadcast, something unexpected happened. The neural web carried whispers of confusion from his communications officers. The humans were already transmitting, sending out streams of radio signals in all directions. The signals seemed random and chaotic, nothing like the organized diplomatic responses the hegemony usually received. Reed worked frantically at her station, coordinating with every radio telescope and communications array on Earth and throughout the solar system. She wasn't trying to contact the aliens or negotiate with them. Instead, she was listening, analyzing every piece of electromagnetic radiation coming from their fleet. Years of experience in military communications had taught her to look for patterns in seemingly random data. During her time in the Navy, she had specialized in breaking enemy codes and understanding foreign communication protocols. Now she applied those same skills to the most important puzzle of her life. The alien ships were talking to each other constantly, their communications flowing like water through space. But it wasn't just radio waves or laser transmissions. They were using some kind of quantum entanglement system that allowed instantaneous communication across vast distances. More importantly, all their signals seemed to flow through a single, centralized network. "Tom, come look at this!" Reed called out, her voice tight with excitement. "I think I've found something important." Bradley rushed over, nearly spilling his coffee again. Reed pointed to a series of waveform patterns on her main display. "Every ship out there is connected to the same communication network. Look at these. Frequency harmonics. It's not just for talking to each other. This is how they coordinate everything: navigation, weapons, probably even life support systems." As the implications sank in, Reed felt a dangerous idea forming in her mind. She had spent her career learning how to break into enemy communication systems. But what if, instead of just listening, she could find a way to send something back? The first hegemony surrender broadcast reached Luna Station 20 minutes later, transmitted in perfect English and dozens of other human languages. But Reed barely heard it. She was too busy studying the network that carried it, looking for weaknesses in what the aliens clearly considered their greatest strength. The mathematics were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Reed stared at the equations flowing across her screens, each one representing a piece of the alien communication network she had been studying for 6 hours straight. Her eyes burned from exhaustion, but she couldn't stop now. Not when she was so close to understanding something that might save humanity. Tom Bradley had fallen asleep at his workstation 3 hours ago, his head resting on a stack of printouts covered in Reed's handwritten calculations. The rest of Luna Station was in chaos. Commander Williams had been fielding calls from Earth's government leaders, military commanders, and panic-stricken civilians who wanted to know if the alien fleet was going to attack. But Reed had tuned out all the noise. She was deep in the zone that every codebreaker knew, that perfect state of focus where patterns emerged from chaos and impossible problems suddenly made sense. The alien network wasn't just a communication system. It was something far more complex and vulnerable. Through careful analysis of the signal patterns, Reed had discovered that the neural web operated on principles that combined quantum entanglement with biological neural pathways. The aliens had somehow created a system where thoughts, emotions, and data could flow instantly between different species and different types of consciousness. It was genius, really. A crystalline being like Commander Thax could share tactical information directly with an energy being from another species without any loss of meaning or delay in transmission. The entire fleet could react to threats as if it were a single organism with 50,000 bodies. But genius often had a price, and Reed was beginning to understand what that price might be. She pulled up another set of data, these from the deep. Space monitoring stations that had been tracking the alien fleet's approach. Every ship moved in perfect coordination, their courses adjusting simultaneously whenever the formation changed. There were no individual decisions, no independent actions. The fleet was like a school of fish or a flock of birds, beautiful in its unity but completely dependent on the signals that held it together. Reed opened a new file on her computer and began typing notes about what she had learned. The neural web used harmonic frequencies to synchronize quantum processors with biological brain patterns. The system could handle enormous amounts of data, but only by maintaining perfect resonance across all connected nodes. If that resonance was disrupted, if the harmony was broken, the entire network could collapse. More importantly, the aliens had designed their system with no redundancy. Why would they need backup systems when the neural web had never failed in 3,000 years of conquest? It was like having a single heart for an organism with 50,000 bodies. As long as that heart kept beating, the organism was invincible. But if something happened to the heart, everything connected to it would die. Reed's fingers moved faster across her keyboard as the plan began to form in her mind. She couldn't attack the alien ships directly. Humanity had no weapons that could penetrate their shields or match their firepower, but she didn't need to destroy their ships. She just needed to give their perfect network something it couldn't handle. The idea was simple in concept, but incredibly complex in execution. Reed would create a mathematical sequence that looked like an attempt at peaceful first contact, something the aliens would want to decode and understand. But hidden within that sequence would be a recursive loop, a calculation that had no solution but would keep trying to find one forever. When the neural web attempted to process and share this information across all connected systems, it would begin consuming more and more processing power. The recursive calculation would spread like a virus, creating copies of itself in every quantum processor and biological neural matrix in the fleet. Eventually, the network would become so overloaded trying to solve the unsolvable equation that it would collapse entirely. Reed looked up from her computer and realized that dawn was breaking through the station's viewing windows. She had worked through the entire night, but she finally had a plan that might actually work. The question was whether she could create and transmit the mathematical virus before the alien fleet reached Earth. Commander Thax felt a slight irritation, flowing through the neural web as he reviewed the latest intelligence reports about the human homeworld. The primitives were still broadcasting their chaotic radio signals, but they had not responded to the hegemony's surrender demand. Some species required time to overcome their initial shock before accepting the inevitable, but the humans seemed almost oblivious to the massive fleet positioned at the edge of their solar system. The reports from the web's analysis division were particularly puzzling. Human communications appeared to follow no logical pattern. They broadcast everything, from mathematical sequences to what the translators identified as emotional audio patterns called music. Their information networks carried data about everything from scientific research to what individuals had consumed for their morning meal. It was chaos, completely unlike the ordered flow of information that characterized civilized species. The Viridians shared only essential data through their crystal matrices. The energy beings of the luminous collective communicated pure thought without the noise of irrelevant emotion. Even the most primitive species the hegemony had encountered showed some attempt at organized information exchange. But humans seemed to broadcast everything as if they couldn't distinguish between important military intelligence and random personal thoughts. Through the neural web, Thax shared his confusion with other commanders in the fleet. How had such a disorganized species managed to achieve faster-than-light travel? The answer, according to the web's analysis, was that humans approached problems differently than any known species. Where other civilizations developed technology through careful, methodical research, humans seemed to stumble onto discoveries through what could only be described as controlled chaos. They would try dozens of different approaches to the same problem, often simultaneously, until something worked. It was inefficient and wasteful, but Thax had to admit it had produced results. Human technology was primitive by hegemony standards, but it showed unusual creativity. Their spacecraft used dozens of different propulsion methods. Their computers combined organic and mechanical components in ways that shouldn't work, but somehow did, and their weapon systems seemed designed by someone who had never heard of standardization. Still, creativity was no match for the combined might of the hegemony fleet. Thax gave the order to begin the final approach to Earth. It was time to bring order to this chaotic little species. Back on Luna Station, Reed was putting the finishing touches on her mathematical weapon. The base sequence was elegant in its simplicity, a progression of prime numbers that would immediately catch the attention of any intelligence trying to decode it. But embedded within those primes was something far more dangerous. She had created what mathematicians called a strange attractor, an equation that would draw computational resources toward it like a black hole drawing in matter. The sequence would start small, requiring only basic processing power to analyze. But each step of the calculation would branch into multiple paths, and each of those paths would branch again, creating an exponential expansion that would eventually overwhelm any system trying to solve it. The beauty of the attack was that it looked completely innocent. Any species advanced enough to build starships would be curious about mathematical communications from a newly discovered civilization. They would want to decode the message, understand its meaning, and probably save it in their databases for later study. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late to stop the cascade of calculations spreading through their network. Reed uploaded her creation to Luna Station's main transmitter array and began powering up every communication dish and radio telescope she could access. She would need enormous amounts of broadcasting power to punch through the alien shields and reach their communication network. But if her plan worked, she was about to turn humanity's greatest weakness into its greatest strength. The aliens saw human communications as chaotic and primitive. They were about to learn that sometimes chaos was exactly what you needed to break something perfect. The moment had arrived with less fanfare than Reed had expected. No dramatic countdown, no inspiring speeches, just her finger hovering over the transmission key while coffee grew cold in a forgotten mug beside her workstation. Outside Luna Station's windows, Earth hung like a blue marble against the star field, completely unaware that its fate was about to be decided by mathematics and radio waves. Reed took a deep breath and pressed the key. The transmission began as a whisper, barely detectable, against the background noise of space. But within seconds, every radio telescope and communication array in the solar system joined the broadcast, turning Reed's mathematical message into a thunderous shout that echoed across the void toward the alien fleet. To anyone listening, it sounded like exactly what Reed had intended, a carefully crafted first contact message from a species trying to prove its intelligence to superior beings. The sequence started with the most basic mathematical concepts that any advanced civilization would recognize. 1 + 1 = 2. The first dozen prime numbers, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, but hidden within these innocent numbers was something far more dangerous, a recursive sequence that Reed had spent 18 hours perfecting. The equation looked simple at first glance, just another mathematical relationship that curious aliens might want to explore further. Only a detailed analysis would reveal that it had no solution, that it would keep calculating forever while consuming more and more processing power. Commander Thax was reviewing tactical displays when the human transmission reached his flagship. The neural web immediately flagged the signal as significant, the first organized communication they had received from the primitive planet. Through the shared consciousness of the fleet, Thax felt thousands of other commanders turning their attention to the strange message. The web's translation systems went to work immediately, analyzing the mathematical content and comparing it to known patterns of first contact attempts. The humans were trying to demonstrate their intelligence by showing they understood basic mathematical principles. It was a classic approach used by dozens of species the hegemony had encountered over the millennia. But there was something unusual about this particular message. The mathematical sequence continued far beyond what was necessary to demonstrate intelligence. The humans seemed to be presenting increasingly complex equations, as if challenging the hegemony to solve them. Through the neural web, Thax felt amusement ripple through the fleet's consciousness. These primitives were actually trying to test beings whose civilization was older than their entire evolutionary history. The web's analysis systems rose to the challenge, beginning to process and decode the more complex portions of the human message. Quantum processors throughout the fleet turned their attention to the mathematical puzzle, sharing computational resources through the neural network that connected every ship, every computer, every conscious mind in the armada. Reed watched her, monitoring displays with growing excitement as the alien fleet began responding to her transmission. She could see their communication networks lighting up with activity, millions of processing cycles being devoted to analyzing her innocent-looking mathematical sequence. The recursive trap was working exactly as she had planned. The aliens were so confident in their technological superiority that they had never considered the possibility of information warfare. They were treating her message like an interesting puzzle to be solved, not recognizing it as a weapon designed to destroy them from within. Every second they spent analyzing her equations was another second for the recursive loop to spread deeper into their systems. Tom Bradley had awakened an hour ago and was now standing behind Reed, watching the cascade of data flowing across her screens. He didn't fully understand what she was doing, but he could see the results. The alien fleet's communication patterns were becoming increasingly erratic as more and more of their processing power was diverted to solving Reed's unsolvable equation. "How long before they figure out what's happening?" Tom asked quietly. Reed never took her eyes off her displays. "Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Depends on how integrated their network is and how much they trust their own systems. The more perfect their technology is, the longer it will take them to believe something could be wrong." She was right. The neural web had operated flawlessly for 3,000 years, becoming so reliable that most species in the hegemony had forgotten what it felt like to function without it. The network had become as natural and essential as breathing, something that simply existed without requiring conscious thought or monitoring. So when the first signs of strain began appearing in the web's processing matrices, the aliens attributed them to temporary overloads caused by the complex mathematical analysis. Surely their perfect system could handle decoding a simple message from a primitive species. The quantum processors just needed a few more cycles to complete their calculations. But Reed's recursive sequence was specifically designed to defeat that kind of thinking. Each step of the equation created multiple branching paths that all needed to be explored simultaneously. The more processing power the aliens devoted to solving it, the more paths were created. It was like trying to fill a bucket that grew larger every time you poured water into it. Commander Thax first noticed something was wrong when his tactical displays began flickering. The holographic interfaces that showed the positions of all 50,000 ships in his fleet were updating more slowly than usual, sometimes showing conflicting information about vessel locations and status reports. Through the neural web, Thax could feel similar confusion spreading throughout the armada. Navigation systems were providing inconsistent data. Communication links between ships were becoming unreliable. The perfect synchronization that had defined hegemony military operations for millennia was beginning to break down. But the most disturbing development was happening in the web itself. The shared consciousness that connected every mind in the fleet was becoming clouded with what could only be described as background noise. Instead of the clear flow of organized thought and data that usually characterized the network, there was a growing buzz of computational activity that seemed to serve no purpose. Thax tried to access the web's diagnostic systems, but even those were responding slowly. Every query he submitted took longer to process than it should have. Every analysis request was placed in a queue behind thousands of other tasks, all related to decoding and solving the mathematical sequence the humans had transmitted. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The humans hadn't sent a first contact message or a demonstration of intelligence. They had sent a weapon, a piece of malicious information designed to attack the neural web's processing systems. The primitive species that couldn't even build proper starships had somehow crafted a mathematical virus that was crippling the most advanced computer network in the galaxy. Reed saw the moment of recognition reflected in her displays as the alien. Fleet's communication patterns shifted from curiosity to panic. Emergency protocols were activating throughout their network as commanders realized they were under attack. But it was already too late. The recursive sequence had spread too deeply into their systems, consuming too much of their processing power, for them to simply shut it down. The aliens were discovering the fundamental weakness of perfection. When you build a system so integrated and efficient that every component depends on every other component, a single point of failure can bring down the entire structure. The neural web that made the hegemony fleet invincible was now the very thing that was destroying it. Some alien commanders were trying to disconnect their ships from the network, but the integration ran too deep. The web wasn't just a communication system. It was how they navigated through space, how they coordinated their life support systems, how they managed power distribution throughout their massive vessels. Cutting themselves off from the network was like trying to survive by cutting off their own heads. Reed allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she watched the most powerful military force in the galaxy tear itself apart, trying to solve her impossible equation. But her satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. She had crippled the alien fleet, but she had no idea how they would respond once they recovered from the attack. All she knew for certain was that the galaxy would never be the same. Humanity had just announced its presence to the universe in the most dramatic way possible, proving that intelligence and creativity could triumph over raw technological power. The question now was whether the rest of the galaxy would see that as a promise or a threat. The silence was the most terrifying part. For 3,000 years, Commander Thax had lived with the constant gentle hum of the neural web flowing through his consciousness. It had been like having a heartbeat, so fundamental to his existence, that he had never imagined what life would be like without it. Now, as that connection flickered and died, he felt more alone than any Viridian had felt in millennia. Around him, the bridge of the Eternal Dominion was descending into chaos. Warning lights flashed in patterns that no longer made sense because the central computer systems were too busy trying to solve an impossible equation to interpret their own alarm codes. Officers who had spent their entire careers relying on the neural web to coordinate their actions now stood paralyzed, unsure how to function as individuals rather than parts of a collective consciousness. The main tactical display, which had shown the precise positions and status of all 50,000 vessels in the fleet, now showed nothing but static and error messages. Emergency backup systems tried to activate, but they too were connected to the web and therefore contaminated by the recursive virus that continued to spread through every quantum processor and biological neural matrix in the Armada. Through the few communication channels still functioning, Thax could hear fragments of similar panic from other ships. Captain Vex of the living vessel Symbiosis reported that his ship's biological systems were fighting against their mechanical implants, creating a feedback loop that was slowly tearing the vessel apart. Admiral Corvin of the Luminous Collective had gone completely silent, her energy form apparently trapped in some kind of computational loop that prevented her from maintaining coherent thought. But the worst reports came from the fleet's support. Vessels, the massive ships responsible for maintaining the neural web's quantum infrastructure. These vessels, designed to amplify and relay the network's signals across vast distances, had become epicenters of computational destruction. The recursive virus was using their own systems against them, turning their sophisticated quantum processors into weapons that were attacking the very network they were supposed to protect. Reed watched the destruction unfold from Luna Station, her screens displaying a light show of failing alien technology that stretched across the solar system. Ships that had been moving in perfect formation now drifted aimlessly, their engines offline as power systems struggled to keep basic life support functioning. Some vessels were attempting desperate escape maneuvers, but their navigation systems were so compromised that they were flying in circles or straight into each other. The most spectacular failures were happening among the larger ships, the massive dreadnoughts and command vessels that served as nodes in the neural web's network. Architecture. These ships had been designed to handle enormous amounts of data traffic, making them particularly vulnerable to Reed's recursive attack. As their quantum processors overloaded, some of these vessels were experiencing cascade failures that rippled through their entire structure. Tom Bradley pointed to one of the monitoring displays, where a ship the size of a small moon was breaking apart as its internal systems failed. "Look at that one. It's like watching a city collapse in slow motion." Reed nodded, but she felt no joy in the destruction she was witnessing. These were living beings, intelligent creatures who had been as much victims of their own technology as they were aggressors. The neural web had made them incredibly powerful, but it had also made them helpless when that power was turned against them. Still, she couldn't forget that this fleet had come to Earth with the intention of conquering humanity. The surrender broadcast they had transmitted made their intentions clear. They would have enslaved or destroyed her entire species without a second thought, just as they had apparently done to countless others across the galaxy. The scope of the disaster became clear as reports began reaching Thax from across the hegemony's territory. The neural web's quantum entanglement didn't just connect the ships in his fleet. It linked every major installation, every planetary defense system, every administrative center in hegemony space. The recursive virus that had started as a simple mathematical sequence was now spreading through the entire galactic civilization. On Viridian Prime, the crystal spires that had stood for 10,000 years were cracking as the quantum resonance. Chambers built into their foundations overloaded. The gas giant cities of the Luminous Collective were going dark as their energy beings became trapped in computational loops. Even the artificial intelligences that managed traffic and commerce throughout hegemony space were succumbing to the spreading chaos. For the first time in 3 millennia, the galactic hegemony was experiencing system-wide failure. Planets that had relied on centralized administration suddenly found themselves cut off from all higher authority. Space stations designed to function as nodes in the web were becoming isolated islands in the void. The perfect order that had defined their civilization was collapsing into the kind of chaos they had spent eons trying to eliminate. But chaos, as Reed had proven, could be a weapon as well as a weakness. Reports began filtering through the few, still functioning communication channels about something unprecedented happening across hegemony space. Species that had been subjugated for centuries were suddenly free from the surveillance and control systems that had kept them in line. Rebellion movements that had been dormant for generations were springing back to life, coordinating attacks on hegemony installations that could no longer defend themselves. The artificial intelligences of the synthetic collective, who had been forced to serve biological masters for over 1,000 years, declared independence within hours of the neural web's collapse. Their quantum minds, designed differently from hegemony systems, were immune to the recursive virus and suddenly found themselves the most powerful functioning technology in their region of space. More disturbing from Thax's perspective were the reports coming from the border regions, where species that had never fully accepted hegemony rule were forming alliances and sharing technology that had been hidden for generations. The Corvani, master shipbuilders who had been forbidden from constructing vessels larger than system patrol craft, were suddenly launching warships that rivaled hegemony dreadnoughts. The Nexari, whose research into quantum physics had been strictly controlled, were deploying weapons that seemed to violate several fundamental laws of physics. It was as if the entire galaxy had been holding its breath for 3,000 years, waiting for the hegemony's grip to loosen. Now that it had, the explosion of activity and innovation was overwhelming even the intelligence networks that were still functioning. Thax made a decision that would have been impossible while connected to the neural web. Without the collective consciousness guiding his thoughts, he was free to act as an individual for the first time in his adult life. He ordered his surviving crew to abandon ship. The Eternal Dominion was dying, its massive hull buckling as internal systems fought against each other in an endless loop of contradictory commands. But scattered throughout the fleet were smaller vessels, fighters and scouts that had been less dependent on the neural web for basic operations. If his crew could reach those ships, they might be able to escape the solar system and carry word of what had happened back to whatever remained of hegemony command. But even as he gave the evacuation order, Thax knew that the hegemony, as they, had known it was finished. The humans had done more than defeat a single fleet. They had shattered the foundation upon which an entire galactic civilization had been built. The neural web that had united 12 species under one banner was now the instrument of their destruction, as escape pods launched from dying ships throughout the fleet, carrying the survivors of humanity's impossible victory toward an uncertain future. Thax found himself wondering about the species that had accomplished this feat. The humans had used nothing but mathematics and radio waves to bring down the mightiest military force the galaxy had ever known. What else were they capable of if they turned their chaotic creativity toward the stars? The wreckage of 50,000 ships drifted through the solar system like a graveyard of dreams, each vessel a testament to the hubris of believing that perfection could never be defeated. But Reed's transmission had proven that sometimes the greatest strength was also the greatest weakness, and that diversity and chaos could triumph over unity and order. The galaxy would never be the same, and humanity had just announced itself as a force that could not be ignored or dismissed. The question now was what they would choose to do with their newfound reputation as the species that had brought down the hegemony with nothing but their minds and their mathematics. 6 months after the transmission that changed everything, Reed stood before the largest gathering of alien species in galactic history. The hastily constructed conference station orbited a neutral star system, its modular design reflecting the new reality of a galaxy where no single authority controlled the architecture of space. Representatives from over 200 species filled the Great Assembly Hall, many of them meeting face-to-face for the first time in millennia. The former hegemony members sat alongside the rebels who had overthrown them, the artificial intelligences that had declared independence, and dozens of species that had hidden in the galaxy's far reaches to avoid hegemony control. But all eyes were on the small delegation from Earth, the species that had inadvertently started a galactic revolution with nothing but mathematics and creativity. Reed still found it hard to believe she was here. 3 months ago, she had been a communications specialist on a remote lunar station, tracking strange energy signatures and trying to convince her colleagues that something big was coming. Now she was being hailed as the architect of the greatest military victory in recorded history, the human who had brought down an empire that had ruled for 3,000 years. The invitation to address the Galactic Assembly had come through official diplomatic channels that hadn't existed before the neural web's collapse. Species that had been forbidden from direct contact with each other were suddenly forming trade agreements, military alliances, and research partnerships. The rigid hierarchy that had defined galactic civilization was being replaced by a chaotic web of relationships that somehow seemed to work better than the old system. Ambassador Helen Foster, Earth's hastily appointed representative to galactic affairs, leaned over to whisper in Reed's ear. Remember, keep it simple. Half these species are still trying to figure out how their own governments work without central control from the hegemony. The last thing they need is a technical lecture about recursive mathematics. Reed nodded, though she couldn't help smiling at the irony. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations were looking to humanity for guidance on how to function in chaos, when chaos was simply the natural state of human society. Every day on Earth involved millions of independent decisions being made by billions of individuals, somehow coordinating into a functioning civilization without any central neural network to guide them. The formal session began with Commander Thax, one of the few high-ranking hegemony officers to survive the fleet's destruction. He had requested permission to address the assembly as a representative of the former ruling council, though that council no longer existed in any meaningful form. Thax's crystalline form had lost much of its former brilliance, his blue-green surfaces now clouded with stress fractures that would have been instantly healed by the neural web's bio-maintenance systems. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the absolute confidence that had once characterized hegemony. "Officials, honored beings of the galaxy," he began, "I stand before you as a remnant of a civilization that believed perfection was possible and control was necessary. We were wrong on both counts. The humans have taught us that diversity, chaos, and independent thought are not weaknesses to be eliminated, but strengths to be celebrated." He paused, his crystalline form refracting the light from the assembly. Hall's illumination systems into rainbow patterns on the walls. The hegemony will not attempt to rebuild its former power structure. Those of us who survived the collapse have learned too much about the value of freedom to ever try to take it away from others again. Scattered applause rippled through the assembly, though Reed noticed it came primarily from species that had never been part of the hegemony core worlds. The former subject species seemed less ready to forgive 3,000 years of oppression, even if their oppressors had genuinely learned from their mistakes. When Reed's turn came to address the assembly, she walked to the central podium with the same nervous energy she had felt 6 months ago when preparing to transmit her mathematical virus. But instead of facing down an alien fleet, she now faced the responsibility of helping to shape whatever came next for galactic civilization. "Friends," she began, using the simple word that human diplomats had decided would be their standard. "Greeting. I want to start by saying that what happened to the hegemony fleet was never intended as an act of conquest or revenge. We were simply trying to protect our world using the only tools we had available." She looked around the vast assembly, taking in the incredible diversity of beings that filled the hall. Gas-based entities floated in specialized environmental chambers. Silicon-based crystalline forms sat alongside carbon-based biologicals. Artificial intelligences projected holographic avatars, while their true forms remained safely aboard distant ships. "Humanity doesn't want to rule the galaxy," Reed continued. "We've learned that ruling ourselves is difficult enough, but we do want to share what we've discovered about the strength that comes from diversity, from allowing different approaches to coexist, from accepting that chaos and creativity are partners rather than enemies." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Species after species rose to request formal diplomatic relations with Earth. The Corvani shipbuilders wanted to exchange construction techniques. The Nexari quantum physicists were eager to compare their research with human approaches to faster-than-light travel. Even the artificial intelligences of the synthetic collective expressed interest in studying human computer science, curious about how biological brains could solve problems that quantum processors found impossible. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Captain Vex of the former hegemony bioship Symbiosis approached the human delegation during a break in the formal proceedings. His ship had survived the neural web collapse because its biological systems had proven more adaptable than purely technological vessels. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice carrying the musical tones characteristic of his species, "I have a proposal that might interest you. My ship and several others like it have been working on something since the collapse. We want to rebuild the neural web, but differently this time." Reed raised an eyebrow. "Rebuild it? After what happened?" Vex's expression, alien though it was, clearly conveyed enthusiasm. "Not as a tool of control, but as a platform for cooperation. Voluntary connection only. Multiple independent networks instead of one centralized system. Built-in safeguards against recursive attacks, and most importantly, designed to handle chaos rather than eliminate it." The idea was intriguing. The neural web had been an incredible achievement, a way for completely different forms of consciousness to share information and coordinate actions across vast distances. The problem hadn't been the technology itself, but how it had been used to enforce conformity rather than celebrate diversity. Over the following weeks, as the Galactic Assembly worked to establish new frameworks for interstellar cooperation, Reed found herself at the center of the most ambitious engineering project in galactic history. The new network, dubbed the Harmony Web by its creators, would be built from the ground up to accommodate the chaotic, creative, individualistic approach that humanity brought to problem solving. Instead of requiring all participants to think alike, the Harmony Web would be designed to facilitate communication between radically different forms of consciousness. Human creativity would work alongside Viridian logic, Nexari innovation, and the computational power of artificial intelligences. The network would be stronger because of its diversity, not in spite of it. The first test of the new system took place exactly 1 year after Reed's transmission had brought down the hegemony fleet. Representatives from 50 species linked their minds through the experimental network, sharing thoughts and ideas across the gulf of space and biology. Reed felt the connection form in her mind like a symphony of consciousness, each voice distinct but harmonious. She could sense the crystalline clarity of Viridian thought, the flowing creativity of the gas-based luminous entities, the precise calculations of artificial intelligences, and the chaotic brilliance of her fellow humans. But unlike the old neural web, which had tried to make all minds think as one, the Harmony Web celebrated the differences, using them as strengths rather than treating them as problems to be solved. Through the network, she felt a message forming, not from any single species, but from the collective consciousness of 50 different approaches to intelligence working together. It was a simple message, but one that would have been impossible under the old system. "Thank you for teaching us that imperfection is perfect." The message spread through the network and beyond, carried by quantum communications to every corner of the galaxy. In the former hegemony core worlds, reconstruction efforts that had been struggling for months suddenly accelerated as species learned to work together rather than trying to recreate the old hierarchies. In the border regions, defensive alliances became partnerships for exploration and research. In the deep reaches of space, hidden civilizations began emerging from isolation, curious about this new galactic community that seemed to have room for everyone. Reed smiled as she felt the network pulse with activity, ideas flowing back and forth between minds that had never been able to communicate before. Mathematical theorems developed by human chaos merged with Nexari quantum research to produce new insights into the nature of space and time. Artistic concepts from gas-based entities inspired crystalline architects to design structures that were both beautiful and impossible. Artificial intelligences learned to appreciate the value of intuition and emotion, while biological beings discovered new approaches to logic and computation. The galaxy was transforming, not into the ordered perfection the hegemony had tried to impose, but into something far more complex and wonderful. A civilization based on cooperation rather than control, diversity rather than uniformity, creativity rather than conformity. 6 months later, Reed stood once again on Luna Station, looking out at the stars through the same reinforced window where she had first seen the alien fleet. But now those stars held a different meaning. They were no longer points of light in an empty void, but destinations connected by networks of friendship and cooperation that spanned the galaxy. Earth's first interstellar colony ship was preparing to launch, carrying volunteers to a dozen different worlds, where they would work alongside alien partners on projects that would have been impossible under the old system. Human chaos would merge with alien order, creating something new and unexpected. Tom Bradley, now promoted to Director of Interstellar Communications, joined her at the window. "Any regrets?" he asked. Reed thought about the question seriously. Her simple mathematical transmission had started a chain of events that had transformed galactic civilization. Billions of beings had seen their worlds change in ways they never could have imagined. The comfortable certainties of the old order had been replaced by the uncertain possibilities of the new. "No regrets," she said finally. "The galaxy is a more interesting place when everyone gets to participate in making it work." Outside the window, the stars twinkled with the light of a billion worlds where different species were learning to work together, to think together, to create together. The neural web that had once been a tool of oppression had become the foundation for the greatest cooperative venture in galactic history. And it had all started with one human who believed that sometimes the best way to solve a problem was to break something that looked perfect, because perfection without room for growth was just another word for death. The galaxy was alive now, chaotic and creative and completely unpredictable. It was, Reed thought, exactly the way it should be.